Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Church World Service webinar series, Caring in Crisis, the Leader Briefs. I'm your host, Reverend Mary Hughes with Crisis Care Ministries, and we're so glad that you've joined us today. We have heard from our colleagues, faith and community leaders, about the challenges facing so many of us in leadership. And so we brought together a series with specialists in crisis response and recovery, family life, mental health, congregational life, to offer us new insights and to give us a word of hope. Today, we are so blessed to have the opportunity to hear from the Bishop Michael Girlinghouse as he discusses Embracing God's Future Without Forgetting the Past, a conversation about loss, grief, and nostalgia in congregational life. But before I introduce him formally, we do have a couple of housekeeping reminders. As you can see from the introductory slide rotation, you can find all things webinar, details about our schedule, the presenters, resources that our presenters have provided at crisiscareministries.net. Just click at the top on the webinar hub and you can find all things webinar. It is updated regularly, so you might need to refresh your page in case you've been there already. Throughout today's webinar, please feel free to type questions or comments in the question box. That's the question box, not the chat box. And we hope to be able to address your questions and comments toward the end of the hour. We will formally close the webinar right at the top of the hour, but if you'd like to stay on a little bit longer, Bishop Mike has agreed to stay for a more informal discussion for just a little while after we formally close the recording and close the webinar itself. After the webinar, watch your inboxes for links to the webinar recordings and a link to the session evaluation. We hear that some of those are going to your spam folder, so you might check there as well. If you have any kinds of questions about your attendance certificates, you can see on your screen here the email address for Heather Wilson, and I believe she'll also put that contact information in the question box. And now it is my great honor to introduce to you today's presenter. Bishop Michael Girlinghouse has served as Bishop of the Arkansas-Oklahoma Synod since July of 2011. Prior to being called to serve as bishop, he was pastor of University Lutheran Church in Norman, Oklahoma, and campus pastor for the University of Oklahoma. Ordained in 1987, Bishop Mike has served as a parish pastor, campus pastor, and in congregations in transition or in need of a substitute pastor. Bishop Mike has also served as an instructor at 2 universities teaching courses in death and dying and world religion. Bishop Mike was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, attending college at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis and seminary at the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. He is married and has 1 adult daughter. He loves to cook, he's a photographer, he's a writer, and he plays the trombone and the djembe drum. So I know you all join me in welcoming Bishop Mike Girlinghouse.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully that you can all hear me. I think we're working, right? Yeah, good. Thanks, Mary. I'm going to share my screen here in a minute, and then we'll get going. While I'm waiting to do that, I want to say thank you to Mary Hughes and to Church World Service for inviting me to be a part of this really important series and to share a little bit of my work around loss and grief and nostalgia in congregational life. Oh, there we go. There. Now you should be able to see my screen. Anyway, welcome. Wherever you happen to be, good day. Hope you are having a good day. For some of us, it's a little earlier in the morning, and I'm sure for others, it's more in the afternoon. It's good to have you and be a part of this with you. And the picture that you see here on the left is a picture I took shortly after Hurricane Katrina in Biloxi, Mississippi, when I was there with some college students taking part in the relief efforts there. And it's really become in many ways a symbol to me and for me of how a lot of our congregations and faith communities are feeling these days after 2 years of pandemic, interchurch divisions, the reality of racial injustice, and on and on and on and on. All the things that our folks have been dealing with have left the church feeling kind of gutted, like a hurricane has hit them. And even before COVID came upon us, many of our churches were struggling with decline, fewer members, and congregations and faith communities that were growing older. And so that's part of the reason why I started looking at this question of loss, grief, and nostalgia, and how those things impact and shape our lives as congregations. But before I do that, I want to say just a little bit about me. That's my book on the left. That's the, I think we're going to do a commercial later for that, so I won't talk. But I want to say a little bit about me beyond what Mary shared with all of you. It started my interest in thanatology and in the topic of death and dying when I was in college, and it's kind of followed me all along. As she said, I taught courses in 2 different universities about this, but I come at this whole topic primarily as a pastor. It's important to say I am not a grief counselor, I'm not a grief therapist, I'm not trained in either of those areas, and have worked in partnership with lots of really fine counselors and therapists over the years. I come at this as a pastor. And I have done pastoral care with bereaved and grieving people throughout my ministry, both as a campus pastor, as a parish pastor, and now as a bishop. But the reason I wrote this book is that as I started my work as bishop and started working with congregations, many of whom were in transition, many of whom were struggling with decline, and now in recent years with the impacts of COVID and other things, I started noticing that the churches as communities of faith were responding to many things in a very similar way to the individuals I had worked with who were stuck in their grief. And I'll say a lot more about that in a little bit. But some of the things that they were doing and saying and ways that they were acting just looked familiar to me. And so I thought, I wonder how grief and loss, or loss and grief really, impact congregational systems. And I started looking around for resources on that, talked to several folks, a couple of pastoral care instructors at some of our seminaries, and everyone said, that's a really good question. And so I started digging into the subject, looking at systems theory and other things. And really, everything I'm presenting to you today was an attempt to me as pastor of our congregations to figure out how I can help people face and deal with and work through their experience of loss and the grief that they were experiencing that really had them kind of stuck and unable to step into God's future. So that's kind of why I did the book. My basic premise as I think about these topics is twofold. One is that loss always results in grief. Loss always results in grief. Whether that's, as you see here, a picture of my wallet, a lost wallet, or more significant losses, the loss of a loved one, friend to death. Loss always results in grief. Now, obviously, if you lose your wallet, the grief is going to be fairly short-lived. Well, I suppose it depends upon how much money you actually have in the wallet. And you work through it, and you get a new wallet. And obviously, when you lose a loved one to death, particularly someone who was very close and important to you, that grief process can take a much greater amount of time and a lot more effort. And you can always get a new wallet, but some losses continue to shape and mold who you are for the rest of your life, that you carry some aspect of that grief with you throughout the remainder of your days. And for people in the church who have experienced loss in a whole variety of ways, sometimes those losses run very deep because churches, congregations, synagogues, mosques, our faith communities are very important to us and are significant relationships in our lives. The second part of my basic premise is while loss always results in grief, change always results in loss. anytime we experience any kind of a change in our life, we have some level of loss that we experience, and therefore some level of grief. Now, this can be both positive change or negative change. I mean, think back to when you graduated perhaps from high school or college, or maybe a graduate program, and you needed to move on to whatever the next phase was in your life. Now, we normally think of graduation as a very positive thing, and it is for most, but it still means leaving behind what you have been doing and moving on to whatever is next, and that is a loss. It means changes of roles and relationships, and that's loss, and so there's grief. And of course, if change is negative change, like a congregation in decline or a congregation dealing with the death of multiple people because of a pandemic, the grief is more intense, but it's still there. Change always results in loss. And so if we're going to be change agents in our congregations, we have to be aware of the fact that people are going to experience that change, whether it's positive or negative, as loss. And that loss is always going to generate some grief. And that grief needs to go somewhere, and we need to do something with it. So that's kind of how I enter into this whole understanding of how we deal as congregational systems, as faith communities, with the kind of loss and change that we've gone through, particularly in recent years. In his study, American Congregations 2015, Thriving and Surviving, David A. Rusin from the Hartford Institute of Religion Research quotes sociologist Ann Swidler, who says this: "Few would disagree that we live in a period of profound social and cultural change. Cultural sociologist Ann Swidler refers to such times as unsettled." My goodness, the last few years have been very unsettled, haven't they, for just a whole bunch of different reasons. By this, she means that traditional ways of doing things typically no longer work, and new strategies for action must be developed without any assurance they will work. A lot of times we talk about that as adaptive work, as adaptive change. And that kind of need to adapt new strategies generates a sense of loss and therefore grief. So before we go too much further, I want to talk a little bit about grief. I know that it's called loss, grief, and nostalgia, but we're going to do the loss and grief in the opposite direction today. So we want to think a little bit about grief and loss. I call these new ways of thinking about grief and loss, but in fact, these ideas are really not that new. For probably the last 20, 25 years, who study and work with grief have gotten away from the whole idea of grief being stages, although that still very much demands the attention of the general public. You know, most of us know Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. And while she was a pioneer in the field, opened up the whole conversation about how does grief work and how do we experience grief. Talking about grief in 2022, according to Kubler-Ross's work, which was done in the late 1960s, is kind of like talking about technology in the church from the perspective of the touch-tone phone, which was invented about the same time Kubler-Ross was doing her work. So we like to talk now about grief as a process that focuses on tasks, not stages. Because any of you who have ever experienced grief know that grief is not like this, but is more like this. At least that's been my experience and the experience of those that I've provided pastoral care to over the years. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's good days, it's bad days. It's some days feeling anger, some days feeling acceptance, some days feeling all sorts of other things. It's a much more tangled process than 5 nice, neat little steps. And that's very true in a faith community as well. We'll back up half a step. The second thing that I want to say in terms of the way we think about grief and loss, so the purpose of grief is not to sever emotional bonds. That's what Sigmund Freud said the purpose of grief was. He was even before Kubler-Ross. It's not to sever emotion bonds with the deceased, but to redefine our relationships with the deceased. Because the only way that we can sever emotional bonds with the loss of a person we loved and cared for is to forget. And who wants to do that? We carry those bonds with us, but in a redefined way. And for congregations, it's very much the same. When a congregation has experienced loss, It's not a matter of saying to the congregation, well, you just need to get over it and forget the way things used to be, because they can't and they won't, and it won't happen. But instead, to say we need to redefine our relationship with the past so that we might step more creatively into the future. And we'll say a lot more about that in just a few minutes. The task-based model that I prefer because it's simple, and as I've provided pastoral care to people over the years, it's something that's easy to explain. There are other task-based models besides the one I'm going to share with you in a moment that are much more complex. But when doing pastoral care and when working with congregations, this one has 4 tasks that we need to attend to, and most people go, oh yeah, okay, I get that. I can see how I'm working on these tasks. They're listed in order, not because they're in stages or steps, you know, do task 1, do task 2, but because you just got to do that to talk about them. They can intermix, they can be worked on in different orders. Sometimes a task you thought you were finished with will come back later and you'll have to work on it some more. So these are based on William Worden's work, Grief Counseling, Grief Therapy, a handbook. The most recent version, I think, is 2009. So task 1 is just accepting the reality of the loss, being able to say, yes, I've experienced a loss and that the loss was real. And I think getting congregations to talk about what they've lost is important as we think about helping a congregation work through the reality of those losses. Second, we need to acknowledge and process the pain of the grief. As we'll see here in a minute, grief generates all sorts of feelings, emotions, and in fact, spiritual experiences. And you have to process that. You have to work through that. You have to name it and claim it, and you can't go around it. So often in mainstream American culture, we try to tiptoe around the grief and not deal with it. And invariably, if you don't deal with the pain of the grief, it will come out sideways, often in very unconstructive ways. And I was seeing that in congregations. That's one of the things that got me started asking these questions. Third, we have to adapt. We have to adapt to the world without the deceased. We have to adapt to the new world we find ourselves in as faith communities. With all of the changes that we've experienced, some of which we've had a hand in, some of which have happened to us just because of the world in which we live. And finally, the 4th task is finding an enduring connection with the deceased or with that which we've lost in the midst of embarking on a new life. The path through grief, as I said, is a crooked one. And because grief is relational, all grief experiences are unique. No 2 losses will be experienced the same way, and our reaction and response to every loss will be different because every relationship is different. And we'll say why that impacts how we deal with congregations and faith communities that are in grief here in a bit. As I said, grief is a common human experience, transcends culture, place, time, although different cultures deal with grief differently. All human beings experience grief. In fact, we have evidence that children as young as 2 or 3 will express grief. And some will even argue that our first experience of grief and loss is the day we're born, when we lose the comfort of our mother's womb. And so grief is a common human experience. It includes emotional, physical, social, and spiritual dynamics. Kubler-Ross identified just 5 common responses to grief. But here's a list of a lot of other feelings that I've heard people express: remorse, regret, relief, guilt, anger, shame, anxiety, loneliness, anguish, abandonment, fear, sadness, joy, yearning, depression, irritation, acceptance, confusion, on and on and on. And we can be feeling any one of those or all of them at once. And that's part of why grief can be really a challenge to work through. And when you multiply that by the number of people in a faith community who are going to be feeling some or all of these feelings at different times, you can see we're dealing with grief within a congregational system. It can be a real challenge. Grief is also a physical response. Loss of appetite, headache, abdominal pain, and within a faith community system, people will react to grief and loss in physical ways. They may not lose their appetite, but they may stop coming to worship, or maybe they'll become hyper involved. And so physically, they will deal with loss in a variety of different ways. There's a social impact: withdrawal, isolation, conflict. Some of this is probably sounding familiar as you think about the faith communities you've been part of. And there is a spiritual impact: loss of meaning, search for new meaning, questioning spiritual beliefs, the strengthening of spiritual beliefs. Congregations will get angry with God because, why would God let this happen to our congregation? Doubt and other kinds of spiritual impacts. Another important thing is that grieving takes time. Right now, in mainstream American culture, most people are given from the time of the loss until the end of the funeral to work through their grief, and then people can't figure out why they haven't gotten back to normal. It takes us a lot longer, particularly with significant losses. One of the problems that we're seeing as we continue to deal with the pandemic is that grief compounds. In other words, every time you have a loss, if you don't finish working through the grief, it gets buried, and then another loss comes, and then another loss comes, and every time it builds exponentially. I recently heard a really good lecture on trauma that's kind of the same way, in that so we are, as a people, as a world, carrying a lot of grief and trauma with us, and that takes a lot of time to unravel and work through. So it's not like you can say to a congregation, well, just get over it. I mean, yeah, I know you've had some loss and you're feeling bad about that, but it's time to move on. We need to be able to give people the time it takes to name and express their grief at the losses they've experienced, and then to work through that. And finally, grieving is hard work. It's hard work emotionally, it's hard work spiritually, and it is hard work physically. Anybody who has experienced a significant loss knows how hard the work is and how it affects all of us, not just our emotions. So we want to talk a little bit about how all of this plays out in congregational systems. We've been actually talking about that a bit, but let's go a little deeper. As I kind of hinted at a few minutes ago, faith communities are complex emotional systems. They are a system of systems. As I was doing my reading and research and working on this, I was reading a lot. There's a couple of scholars in Australia who've done a lot on grief in family systems. And faith communities can function very much like family systems, and there's been a lot of work done on how family systems impact the life of a faith community. But a faith community is also a system of systems. And so as people come together in that faith community, they come carrying with them their own understanding of how grief works, of how grief is expressed, and of how grief is shared. And if your faith community is made up of a whole variety of different people coming from a variety of different backgrounds, or even a congregation that's fairly homogenous in its makeup, each family will bring their own understanding of grief. And so some families might be very expressive of grief, others might withdraw. We even see this within families, that individuals within a family system respond to grief very differently. It's one of the reasons when working with a family, a couple that's lost a child, the spouses may react to that loss very, very differently. One might withdraw, and the other one might want to talk about it and talk about it and talk about it, and it can cause some real challenges within the marriage. Then you bring that into a faith community where everybody is bringing a different culture of dealing with grief to them, and it can become very complex. Second, faith communities are often fluid in terms of membership and participation. I once was working with a congregation, and I asked the folks that were there at the table, their counsel, I said, so when was this congregation at its best? Let me, talk about when this congregation was really at its best. And the ones who had been there a long time talked about 10 years ago or 15 years ago when this particular pastor was there, whatever. And then one person who was a fairly new member of the congregation, a newcomer, said, I think that we're at our best right now. That's why I joined this church. And so it's like, the longtime folks were like, really? And so people's relationship with the congregation or the faith community is different due to how long they've been there, how much they've been involved. Another example of this is how people think about, say, converting a Sunday school classroom or an education space into food pantry. For those people who have been there a long time, and they can remember their children being instructed there, they can remember adult study groups that were in that classroom, maybe committee meetings. They have all sorts of memories in that space. Giving it up as education space may generate a lot of grief and loss. But maybe in recent days, it's just become a junk room because there really isn't much education going on in the faith community anymore. And the newcomers might go, it's just like a junk closet. Let's clean it out and put it to some good use. So you can see they may have very different sense of even the spaces in a worship building or other building where the community gathers. Faith communities, though, do have a culture of loss. A way as a system, they respond to and react to grief. And then sometimes the members' approach to grief will fit into that, sometimes it won't. Just real quickly, we can spend a lot of time on this, but because we don't have a lot of time together today, I'm going to kind of go through this pretty quickly. These are sort of some of the things you want to look at as you think about what is the culture of loss in your faith community. What level of cohesion does the faith community have? Are they enmeshed? Are they very turned in and deeply connected to one another? A lot of rural congregations that I work with are highly enmeshed, and so they're not very flexible, or are they disengaged? I've worked with, say, suburban congregations that the folks see each other for an hour on Sunday. For the rest of the time, they basically are off doing other things because they work in the city or whatever. Or are they flexible? Do they kind of know how to roll with the punches? All of that will affect the way a congregation or faith community deals with loss. What's the level of communication? Are they expressive? Do they kind of shy away from communication? Is communication good or not good? The better and more open the communication is, generally, the better a congregation or faith community will deal with a culture of loss. What are the structures and the roles and the relationships of the various people within the faith community? How are decisions made? Who makes those decisions? How do people relate to each other? And across faith communities, those structures, roles, and relationships are going to be very different. Sometimes they contribute to the expression of grief and loss within the life of the community. Other times they can get in the way, and sometimes both. What is the faith community's health-seeking behaviors? I have 46 congregations in my synod, some of whom I hear from almost weekly because they're always looking for help, support, encouragement, resources. Others, I've probably heard from 2 or 3 times in the last 10 and a half years because they're pretty independent and they do their own thing and they're okay with that and they figure it out on their own. And so the congregation or faith community is really stuck in their grief. If they are not prone to looking for help, might need a little nudge or some encouragement or some reaching out to say, maybe we can walk with you on this. How much conflict there is in the system? Obviously, the more conflict, the more difficult it is to address questions of grief and loss. And then what is the congregation or faith community's loss history? We do this now with congregations. We do timelines with them and we say, we want to know when you've been through some hard stuff. The loss of a faith leader, the loss of a building due to a fire or a tornado or some other natural disaster, the loss of significant members and other leaders within the life of the congregation. And then finally, what is the local culture of loss? Because Not only may the faith community be dealing with their own sense of loss, but they also may be dealing with loss in the broader community. And that certainly has been true during this pandemic time, because it's not just the loss that people are experiencing in the faith community, but it's also the losses that people are experiencing all around them in their city or their rural community, and certainly in the last 2 years, the losses we've been experiencing as an entire globe. All of those things will impact the way that we process and deal with the experience of loss and the grief that comes from it. I tend to get ahead of my PowerPoint sometimes. So community experiences in history. What are the local demographics? Is the community growing? Is it declining? And such. So when congregations are in the midst of loss and grief, they do what we do as individuals. They begin to think about the time before they experience the loss. Generally, when we lose somebody we love, we spend a fair amount of time thinking about that person, thinking about our relationship with that person, reminiscing, thinking back to the good times. Usually a little later on, we start remembering some of the struggles. That's usually not right away. But we start working through those memories, and we start sorting through those memories, and congregations do the same thing as they think about their own experiences of grief and loss. And that's what got me thinking about the whole question of yearning and nostalgia. For a long time, I believed that a congregation that was being nostalgic was really just stuck in the past, and that they just needed to get over it. You know, let the past go. You know, stop getting trapped in all the used to be's. I'll say more about used to be's here in a bit. But just let it go and get on with it. And it occurred to me as I started doing this research to simply go into a faith community and say, you know, forget the past, get over it, let's get on with the future, without helping them deal with the grief and loss, is like saying to somebody who's just lost their spouse, well, you know, you should just get over that person, go get married again. Or even worse, a parent who's lost a child, well, you know, you can always have another child. That's horrible. I mean, that's harmful, that's abusive. And yet that's what we tell congregations all the time. Just get over it. We can get on with something else without ever actually dealing with the grief and the loss. So I started looking at this whole question of nostalgia and discovered that there's a difference between yearning and nostalgia. Now, yearning, as it says here, is a common grief response. It's characterized by a desire to reclaim or recreate the remembered past, but can trap us if it's not resolved. So most individuals who are yearning for their loved one to come back work through that fairly early on. They have little spates of it as they go along, obviously down through the months or the years. My father has been gone for 25 years, and there are still some days I go, just really wish my dad were here. Get a little spate of yearning, but for the most part, the yearning fades more into the background and is replaced by other kinds of ways of relating to the person and their memory. But yearning can trap us, and individuals working through their grief, and I've experienced and walked with people pastorally this way, who just can't get past the yearning. They are months and months out, and they're still just so desperately wanting that person back. And it can trap us. That's when it becomes problematic. Nostalgia, on the other hand, is a common human coping mechanism that draws strength from the memories of the past and helps us to adapt to the present and gives us hope for the future. A lot of this is based on the work of a sociologist at North Dakota State University, Clay Rutledge. Has a summary of his research and the research that he's done with others called Nostalgia, a Psychological Resource from 2016. So let's talk a little bit about yearning. A bishop friend of mine once said, trying to recreate the past is like reaching for a chocolate chip cookie at the potluck, biting into it and finding out it was raisin. I've always kind of liked that. And that's really what trying to recreate the past through yearning is like. because, number one, recreating the past isn't possible. Why? Because first, the world has changed. You know, if you're pining for and yearning for the church of 1980 or 1960 or 1955, the reality is the world has changed. You cannot recreate the past from 1972 because it's not 1972 anymore. And the world around us functions so much differently than it did in 1972. And to recreate that thing, if it were even possible, would be no more functional today than that touch-tone phone I mentioned earlier. And you know, we have congregations who are trapped in their past who are still functioning like it was 1972 or 1983 or 1955. There are faith communities that are still doing things the same way they've always doing it and wondering why it doesn't work anymore. It might have been great before, but the world has changed. The second problem is that the remembered past never really existed. The remembered past never really existed. I kind of got onto this listening to a TED Talk about how memory works quite a number of years ago, and it made a lot of sense. The researcher was talking about the fact that as we remember things, particularly stories we tell over and over and over again, and anybody who knows me knows that I love telling stories. The more we tell stories, the more we massage them, the more we filter them, and the more we reshape them. And frequently, those positive stories, we become the hero of our own stories. My mother and I have this problem all the time, because I'll recount a story from my childhood, and my mom will go, "That's not how it happened." "Oh no, that's how it happened," I say. "No, that's not how it happened at all." And she tells me what she remembers. I go, "No, that's not right." And we go back and forth. That's because both of us have told those stories so many times that we've filtered them and we've shifted them. According to this TED Talker, the reality is those memories that come back to us that we haven't thought about in years, you know, like, oh man, I haven't thought about that in a long time, and it just sort of comes back to us, are probably more accurate than the stories that we've told over and over and over and over again. And so as a congregation yearns and remembers this past that they want to recreate, or they're yearning to recreate, the reality is it's been so massaged over the years that it probably never existed in the way they remember it at all. So we can get trapped in the past. The technical term, or the diagnostic term for this, is prolonged grief disorder. It has a lot of other names. It can result from experiences of complicated grief. And certainly the grief that congregations have, as we've already said, is very complicated. And so it's easy to get trapped if there's lots and lots of complications. And because there's been so much trauma in the last several years, and so many different levels and in so many different ways, the grief we are experiencing right now in the life of our congregations is complicated. And so it's easy to get trapped in yearning for a past that's gone. Part of the diagnostic protocols for diagnosing prolonged grief disorder: preoccupation with the past, emotional numbness, intense sorrow and emotional pain, bitterness or anger, difficulty accepting the loss, maladaptive appraisals about oneself, difficulty trusting others, feeling alone or detached, feeling life is empty or meaningless, confusion about one's role or a diminished sense of identity, difficulty with positive reminiscence, difficulty or reluctance to pursue interests or plan for the future. Now you think about your faith community in that list, and I went through it really pretty quickly. But if you think about your faith community, if you were going to go through that as a checklist, how many of them would you check in thinking about the struggles your faith community is going through, particularly as we come to this point in the pandemic? I don't know about you, but a lot of the congregations that I work with, I could check off a lot of these. And those are all symptomatic of a congregation that is trapped in its past because they have not effectively worked through the loss and the grief that they've experienced. So how do we get unstuck? This, by the way, if you've never been to Yellowstone, is a picture of the traffic going through Yellowstone. I was thinking, oh, Yellowstone's wonderful, and we're going to be able to drive and see all this wildlife, and I spent most of the week sitting in traffic. That's worse than the traffic in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where I live at rush hour. Anyway, the only way through grief is to grieve. I kind of applied that earlier. If you try to tiptoe around grief, it comes out sideways. And you see that in faith communities, at least I do in the ones I work with. It comes out as conflict, it comes out as divisiveness, it comes out as passive aggressive behavior, people just leaving, people trying to maintain control over things that they really either can't or shouldn't be controlling, and on and on. The only way through grief is to grieve, to name it, and to talk about it and to work through it. And that's why grief is best processed through narrative, through storytelling. And so now when I work with congregations, I don't tell them to get over the past, I get them to talk about the past. I just did this with a congregation over this past weekend. We spent about 20 minutes in this workshop I was leading. And I said, just tell me stories about this congregation when it's really been at its best, when it's really been at its greatest. And they had a great time reminiscing with me. And it was starting to tap into that nostalgic stuff that we'll talk about here in just a moment. But storytelling, I mean, one of the things we do with grieving people is say, so tell me about the person you've lost. And that's very helpful in helping transfer those emotional bonds from living bonds into one of memory that continues to speak to us. It's important to normalize grief, to say grieving is okay, it's normal, it's a common human response. I will frequently, in my own faith tradition, point to the story of the raising of Lazarus in the Gospels, when Jesus raises his friend Lazarus from the dead. But before he does that, he grieves with the people. And I think that blesses grief, because I hear from folks in my work tradition, well, if I really believed, I wouldn't feel so bad about this person dying. It's like, no, it's just a normal thing. And it's just a natural response. Promote social engagement, keep people engaged with one another. Build motivation for change. You're not going to start with the change, you're going to have to get there. And we could spend a lot of time talking about that, and others have done a lot of work around how do you move a community, a faith community, or any other kind of organization to change. And then help identify aspirations for making meaning, new aspirations, because a lot of times with the losses a faith communities experience, they've lost a sense of their identity. They used to be the big church or the big organization, you know, the faith community in town that everybody was a part of, and now there's 15 of them coming for worship, and so they need to redefine and their aspirations for who they are and what they're about. Alternate focus on loss and restoration. So you don't just sit and dwell in the loss. You need to do that. You need to kind of sit in the dust and mourn, but then also talk about what's potentially next. And so both of those things happen at the same time. Let's talk a little bit about nostalgia. That, by the way, is a picture of my very first camera. There's Clay Rutledge, who did this work on nostalgia. What Rutledge found in his research is that nostalgic memories, contrary to yearning, nostalgic memories help build us up. They build social connectedness as we tell the stories with one another. And in a faith community, telling the stories helps newcomers to engage in who the congregation is and understand something of where they've been and what they're becoming. It builds self-awareness and self-esteem. You know, I worked with a congregation one time. I thought we were going there to close the congregation. And we were sitting around with the council. It was mostly elders, many of whom had been there when the congregation started. And we were telling stories. And they were talking about the best time was when they were brand new and they were meeting at a library and they were setting up chairs and taking down chairs and setting up chairs and putting all this energy, and they had new people coming, and it was a great time. I said, what can we learn from that? what can we learn about who you are and what you're about from that? And they said, after some conversation, one of the women said, when we work together, we can accomplish a lot. And I said, and how can you take that now, that lesson from that time into the future? And she said, well, if we work together now, we can accomplish a lot. To which another member of the council said, yeah, but we were a lot younger then. To which the first woman replied, we just need to do it slower. And in the days since we had that conversation, that little church has come alive. They're doing things in their community. They're talking about mission and ministry in ways that they hadn't in a long time. And they're doing it slower. So these nostalgic memories can help us tap into who we are and what we're about as we think about successes in the past and what they might teach us about how we move forward. It can help us engage meaning and significance and a sense of vitality. Nostalgia also contributes to belonging. I kind of alluded to that a moment ago as we share the stories and talk about where we've been, both the positive and the negative. It helps us to feel connected to one another. When we think about how we've had successes in the past, it can make us more optimistic about moving into the future. It can invoke inspiration, kind of like it did that little congregation. You know, they weren't maybe ready to go back to the library and put up chairs again, but they knew that they could find energy in working with one another like they did then. It can boost creativity. I love working with teams and groups as we talk about our experiences from wherever we've been and bring that all together. Actually, creativity is not necessarily about having an original idea. It's about taking a whole bunch of old ideas and creating something new. And as we each bring our own nostalgic stories to bear, we can come up with creative solutions and even adaptive solutions to the challenges we face. I always like this a quote from Saul Bellows' Mr. Samler's Planet. Character Wallace says this in that novel. Nostalgic memories keep the wolf of insignificance from the door. As we think about the past, where we've been, and for people of faith, how God has walked with us through both the good times and the bad. It can help us remind ourselves of who we are, whose we are, and the fact that God walks with us. I think that's one of the power and the richness of the Hebrew Scriptures, is that the Hebrew Scriptures, and to a certain extent the New Testament as well, but the Hebrew Scriptures tell the story of God's people walking with God and how God has walked with them through some good stuff and through a whole bunch of bad stuff. It's honest, it's raw, and yet in the end, they keep coming back to God as a God of steadfast love, who even when God steps back, God will always reclaim us. And I think that's kind of the power of those kinds of memories. We tell those stories to remind ourselves that God has walked with us, is walking with us, and will continue to walk with us even as we step into the future. So how do we embrace God's future without forgetting the past? First, we have to come to see the past as a resource, not yearning for the past to recreate it, but as stories out of which we can draw our core values, the things that make us who we are, that motivate us and can teach us what we might do to honor all of those things as we step into the future. So we tell the stories not to recreate them, but to use them as a resource. We embrace God's future without forgetting the past by becoming learning communities. Always learning, learning from others, learning from one another, learning from books, webinars like this one, but that we commit ourselves to being learning communities. We embrace God's future by using our nostalgic memories as we work through the loss and the grief to find new energy for ministry. And that doesn't happen right away. People who are grieving, individuals who are grieving, do get to a point at some point where they feel like they have renewed energy. That doesn't mean they've forgotten who they've lost or how important that person was, but they've discovered that those memories now have a different place, and that those relationships inform their lives in a different way than in the early days after their loss. And finally, always be ready to be surprised by the power and presence of God, because God is always surprising us. And to be confident that the future is in God's hands, and that God will carry us into that future, maybe in ways that we never even dreamed or imagined. Kind of like most of us having adapted to this technology in the last 2 years, right? I mean, if you had told most of our faith communities in the fall of 2019 that in 6 months you're going to be doing worship on Zoom, they would have said, "What's a Zoom?" And second, they would have gone, "Yeah, no, that's never going to happen." And how many of our congregations and our faith communities made that pivot with amazing speed in the spring and early summer of 2020. God can surprise us. Finally, this is kind of the summary of what we've been talking about. I like the bicycle wheel. It's a wonderful metaphor for the way I understand life. At one point in my life, I did a lot of bicycling. Not now, but the spokes on the wheel have to be in tension between the rim and the hub, the center, in order for the bike wheel to turn and not wobble. And so there's got to be a balance. And I remember spending hours balancing my tires, trying to get them to keep the wobble out of it. And so as we do this work, we need to balance our work and our naming and sorting through loss and grief with new creations, with the new things God is calling us to do. There needs to be a balance there. As human beings, we need to have some sense of continuity with our past. That's a psychological, emotional, and I think spiritual need that we have. Some sense that what we're doing now is connected in some way to what we did yesterday and the day before and the years before that. But we also need a spirit of innovation, a willingness to experiment, try new things, and to step out into the future God is always calling us to. And as we do that, we take up life again, we move forward, and we remember forward. We remember the past so we might step into the future. And that's where I'm going to wrap it up. I'm sure there's probably I haven't been paying attention to the chat, but we've got about 7-8 minutes left, and we'll go from there.
Mike, you do have a number of comments in the questions. Let me just say, I'm sure I'm not the only person that was nodding along with you. I hope you felt those nods, even though you couldn't see us. Such a wonderful presentation. One question that I want to just read out loud from Laurel Hamilton is, she says, "I'm so recognizing so many of these symptoms in my congregation. Is Bishop Girlinghouse's session this morning basically a synopsis of his book? Hopefully," she says.
I'm doing some rearranging on my screen here, so I'm not doing those. Yes, that is a synopsis of the book.
And you can find the link to the book at the Webinar Hub under resources as well, or you can just tell us it's this title and search online.
Yeah, it's the same title as the title of the presentation, which that's why it's the longest title of all of the presentations during the series. Yeah, it's hang on, I actually brought a copy along so I can do the commercial. Give me 2 seconds. Yeah, I had a screen earlier. It's called "Embracing God's Future Without Forgetting the Past," a conversation about loss, grief, nostalgia, and congregational life. So that's the book. It's available through Fortress, which is, I think, the link. It's also, I believe, still available on Amazon. So
I did see it on Amazon as well. Other questions and comments here relate to the PowerPoints, how much people appreciated the PowerPoint, and we'll work on letting people be able to have a copy of that, or at least what they might be able to see. Another comment here: "Thank you for a compelling presentation and very helpful. I've been grieving personally, and this presentation said a lot to me." excellent work in a presentation. It would be a really good Bible study, is what someone has said here as well.
Before I stop just a second. Thank you for the person who talked about grieving personally, because in fact, that's an important part of this dynamic as well, that we as leaders are grieving and we need to deal with our grief. That actually adds to the complexity of what happens in a faith community. And we need to deal with our grief too. And so people are grieving individually. We as leaders are grieving. And as I said, grieving is hard work. It's one of the reasons, not the only, why we're all so tired. And then comment to the Bible study, the book has actually Bible studies in it. So on each chapter has a Bible study. So.
Wow. So people could pick it up and actually, you've already done some of the groundwork for us. So.
Yeah, it was designed to be used in a congregation, either a study group or in a council, or it's got 12 chapters very intentionally, so you could do a chapter a month. And so it can be used in a variety of different ways. And then there are throughout the book, there are little exercises. So I was talking about like the timeline work. There's a timeline exercise in there, and there's some things that you can do. And then there's little conversation boxes throughout. So it's really designed to be a book used. You can read it by yourself, but it's actually designed to be read in a group or with others. So.
Bishop Mike, I think you told me at one point you had done workshops actually with this curriculum. Am I correct on that? You'd done some different kinds of presentations that were a little bit longer. Am I remembering that correctly?
That's correct. I've done some longer. I did a whole day long thing for the American Baptists in New York. I've done a couple of synod assemblies where I've done a variety of, a series of shorter pieces. So yeah, yeah, almost all of it's been online because of course we've been in, the book came out in August of 19. So it's, most of this has been in this format. So
there are a few other questions. Have you been able to pull out your question box there?
Yeah, the question box is here, but it's like I'm not exactly sure how this box works, to be honest.
It's a different format.
Yeah, it's not scrolling. So if you would be so kind as to keep reading the question.
I will. There's one question. Well, there are, again, lots of comments thanking you for the presentation. One question, any suggestions for hospital chaplains to process their secondary trauma?
Say that.
Any suggestions for hospital chaplains to process their secondary trauma? So their witnessing of traumatic events.
Yeah. Make sure you got somebody to talk to. I mean, that's the short answer to, because I mean, yeah, I think caring for the caregivers is so important, and particularly those who are in the medical community. But yeah, a friend of mine, long time ago, taught me this: that when we're grieving, we all need two things. We need a safe person, and we need a safe space. He had lost a teenage son, and he used to come talk to my classes about parental grief. And he said that after his son died, he had one person that he could just sit and just cry and scream and do whatever. And his safe space, he said, was his car commuting to the church where he was serving at the time. He said I would sit in my car, roll up the windows, and just yell and scream and shout. And he said, and so everybody else on the highway just thought I was singing. But so that was his safe space that he could just, I used to say to him, but if you were crying, didn't it make it kind of hard to drive? And he said, well, I tried not to do that, but it was kind of, but you need a safe person and a safe space, some place where you can just be and just let it all hang out. So, and so cultivating, I think that's the answer is,
Thank you.
And it's really tough to find a good counselor or therapist, because there are great grief counselors and therapists out there that can help us work through this stuff. I mean, a lot of times in my pastoral work, if somebody was really stuck and if I really felt that they were suffering from prolonged grief disorder, I would immediately refer them. I mean, I'd continue to provide pastoral care, but I really knew where my limits were, and would help them connect with somebody who had that kind of professional training.
Well, Bishop Mike, we are at the top of the hour. A reminder that we will be here a little bit after the hour as well to continue in a more informal conversation. But I know if you all had your cameras on, you would be applauding right now and saying thank you to Bishop Mike. So thank you again, Bishop Mike. What a wonderful presentation. As you can see from the comments, how rewarding and how hopeful your conversation has been for those who have participated today. Just a reminder to everyone to watch your email for the links to the evaluation as well as your attendance certificates. We do hope that you will join us next week. We will be hearing from one of our amazing communicators, Rabbi Vered Harris, as she visits with us about taking the long view with faith. She'll be talking with us about theodicy and challenge and resilience and hope through the lens of Jewish history and text. So thank you all again for joining us. Don't forget to go to the webinar hub at crisiscareministries.net. Click on the webinar hub for all things webinar. And some of us will be here for a little bit longer for those of you that do